Pope Francis has a real appeal for Catholics and non-Catholics, a very broad appeal. I think that Pope Francis has shared this authenticity of his ministry. He comes across as very simple and warm and gentle, and I think people are taken by this credible witness that he is to Christ's love and God's love for us more broadly. He exudes this warmth and gentleness. He shows this value and importance on encounter, the encounter with Jesus, and also encountering one another and seeing the face of Christ in others. I think he has shown this, and people have been really receptive to this. Certainly, Pope Francis this will be his first visit to the United States, so I think it's met with much awe and intrigue. He's the first non-European pope. He's Argentine in heritage, and this is the first time a pope will speak before a joint session of Congress, so his visit is much anticipated. It's a blessing to work at Bread for the World, a Christian policy advocacy organization seeking to end hunger. I've spent the last decade at Bread for the World, and it's been a real joy to live out the ministry and my faith through that means. I come from a strong Catholic background. I've had a strong Catholic family and have a deep sense of call. And so working on long-term root causes to end hunger is critical to my faith, and it's become a vocation for me as a laywoman. Pope Francis reminds us that we are one human family. Even in his papacy thus far, he has traveled to countries like Cuba and Korea and the Philippines and Bolivia, and he's traveling to the United States. He reminds us that we are a universal church and that our lives are interconnected. So that first is a witness of the universality of our faith. In terms of his credibility or his authority, our Catholic tradition tells us that our faith should inform the systems and structures of our government and public policy, and that the role of government and public policy is to promote human dignity and the common good. So our faith tells us that we have to engage the process of the politics and the policies around us. And so the fact that Pope Francis is speaking to the president and speaking before a joint session of Congress, he is a man representing the church and sharing the values and shaping government policy with his witness. I would say thirdly that Pope Francis, as the head of the Roman Catholic Church, speaks with significant authority because of the credibility of the church on serving the most vulnerable. Agencies like Catholic Charities, domestically and communities all over the country or internationally in relief and development efforts, the work of Catholic Relief Services and Caritas Internationalis, those organizations are standing in some of the toughest, hardest to reach communities. And so with that credibility, he can speak about poverty and he can speak about meeting the needs of the most vulnerable people on the planet when he speaks to these powerful leaders in this country. Pope Francis takes seriously the scriptural mandate that nations will be judged on how they treat the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. And he elevates that through his travel, through his exhortations, through his recent encyclical, and in his personal connections, he highlights poverty, and he has something to say about it, that it needn't be that way, and that we're not to be apathetic or indifferent to it. Another backdrop to Pope Francis's visit will be his message of God's love for us. It's so important in the documents he shared in the joy of the gospel and the importance of the encounter, a personal encounter with Christ, and an encounter of your neighbor. He has elevated this concern. He talks about God's love for us, and he exudes that warmth. Pope Francis tells us of God's abundant love for us. But that's not the end of the story. As disciples, we need to reflect that love back to the world. We have a role in being reconcilers and rebuilders and restorers, that Christ is victorious over death and sin. God's at work in the world, and we have a role to play in it. We know that Pope Francis has elevated poverty in a way that's pretty significant across the globe. In his travels and in his exhortations, in his simple gestures, and in how he talks about meeting injustice and caring for the most vulnerable. I think there are 3 Catholic social teaching principles that Francis uses to anchor sort of this approach on poverty. First would be human dignity. That's the understanding that you and I were created in God's image. We are image bearers. And with that power of having our human dignity, we have certain rights, inalienable rights, because of that self-worth, because God made us. In perfect counterbalance, the Catholic social teaching principle of solidarity comes in. If we were to go too far on individual rights or human dignity that leads toward individualism or isolation, then solidarity comes in, and it balances our need for community, our need for each other to live interdependently, that our lives are interconnected and that we belong together. That is the mark of thriving, of human flourishing, and the flourishing of creation. The third aspect of Catholic social teaching that Francis exudes so well is his emphasis on the preferential option for the poor. The Roman Catholic Church is universal. It's massive. It's many in number. It's powerful. It has a complex structure. But preferential option for the poor, this principle says that the mission and the service of the church is central, that how we treat the most vulnerable amongst us is key for how we live out our faith. We know that in Jesus' ministry, he was committed to those who were marginalized and excluded and who were most vulnerable. And Pope Francis shares that preferential option for the poor in all that he does to keep that mission central to the church. I've traveled across this country, kind of back and forth, and I used to live in one of the most lush valleys, agricultural valleys in the country out west. And something that always struck me, both living on the east and on the west and in between, is how fertile this country is and how lush our land is. And it strikes me that despite that abundance, that there are still 49 million Americans who struggle to put food on the table every day. 1 in 5 children live in households where they don't know where their next meal is coming from. If there was no poverty, there would be no hunger. Across the globe, over 1 billion people from developing countries live in extreme poverty. They live on less than $1.25 a day. Every year, 2.5 million children die from hunger-related causes. So whether you're looking at hunger abroad or hunger internationally, every year, families across the globe are struggling to feed their families. This means empty cupboards. This means that moms skip meals so that their kids eat. This means that 45% of child deaths are related to malnutrition. This means that mothers die unnecessarily in pregnancy. This means that kids go untreated from preventable diseases. And we even know that kids who don't have the right nourishment, especially in their early years, it limits their brain growth. It limits the way that they're able to flourish. Pope Francis tells us there's no place for resignation or indifference in our faith. There's no room for apathy. So we need to meet the realities of hunger and the needs in our communities with hope and joy. Hunger is actually one problem that we can solve. While Pope Francis is in the United States, he will visit New York. He will meet with world leaders who are discussing and adopting global development goals. One of those goals will be to end hunger by 2030. It's feasible. If we share our Christian faith, if we share the hope and the joy of the gospel, and we bring that to the idea of ending hunger, it's feasible. It's been a blessing to work at Bread for the World for the past decade. Bread for the World is a Christian policy advocacy organization seeking to end hunger at home and abroad. It focuses on long-term root causes of hunger. It's been a way that I can live out my Catholic faith. It's been my vocation. I invite you to join me in pledging to end hunger, because I know I have a responsibility to help. Pope Francis has inspired us to do many things with his visit. In anticipation of his visit and also beyond, we are called to be Christ's disciples here and to work to serve those who are most vulnerable in our midst. In pledging to end hunger, I pledge to pray for my political and civic leaders that they can take bold action to end hunger and poverty. And when we pray, we know that we're depending upon God, because really little else can happen without God's help. I'm pledging to give my time and my resources to change the root causes of food insecurity and to feed hungry people. And I'm pledging to act with hope and courage so that God's world can flourish. Please join me in pledging to end hunger.